This is literally the coolest thing I've ever 3D printed, and honestly, the whole project was super easy. And I've tried doing these videos before, you know, the sort of I just printed a cool thing, but in all honesty, those videos generally tend to tank for my channel. But not anymore, because I finally got the chance to actually finish a project. Well, I'm saying chance, but the truth is, it's my own ADHD that lets me down. And whilst this isn't a woe is me, I have ADHD video, because in wargaming, most of us have some ADHD traits, or perhaps just a lack of willpower. I'm sure that many of you watching can relate to multiple scenarios in your hobby of being halfway through a project before getting distracted by the potential of another. Or a squirrel. But today is a red letter day for me because I did it. I finished something, which means you can too. So hi, I'm Ross and this is WARHAMMER Videos. So as I was saying, I not only printed but also painted the world's most realistic and somewhat working bolter, which means that it was easy and you can do it too. And whilst this video isn't sponsored, I would be remiss not to share that this was all done on my Bamboo Lab X1 Carbon, and that was kindly provided to me by the guys over at Bamboo Lab, and the model files themselves were provided by Tame Grips. All the links in the video below. If you're buying stuff, click them please. And this is one of my first 4 projects using an FDM printer. I typically print miniatures and other models using resin printers, so it probably won't surprise you that, somewhat separate to my 3D printing hobby, I'm also a huge Warhammer fan. Though I wouldn't go printing copies of their miniatures, because that's naughty. However, since they clearly don't sell replica bolt guns, my attitude to this project was a tad more, f it. And besides, if Games Workshop do ever realise that they should have already partnered with NERF and get those products on the market, then this can just go in the bin. I mean, we're already halfway there by giving Space Marines NERF blasters, now we just need NERF to give us bolt rifles. Anyway, I'm sure we've all got some appreciation for cosplay, even if it's just aesthetically. It's why I follow Frankly Built and his awesome Iron Man costumes, and those are all 3D printed too. And in fact for me, at Warhammer Fest last year, I spent most of my time hanging around with the cosplayers. Forget how great they look, can you imagine just the engineering that goes into these creations? Like many of us, I'd love to try a cosplay project, but between life, our website and this channel, I've neither the time nor the energy to put in order to commit to such a project and learn the skill required to do something like this. And also, ooh, squirrel. What was I saying? Thankfully though, as I said, this project was really easy, and to many viewers' delight, required no hours of sanding PLA to look this smooth. Now, I say required specifically because while in retrospect it didn't require any sanding, yeah, I did have a go just to see if it would help, but I quickly realised I'd get a smooth enough model without sanding, or acetone vapor tents, or resin layers. And that's all thanks to some hobby cheating that I'll come back to. Now this is a really well designed and put together model. It's broken down into sections such as upper assembly, lower assembly, the magazine and some optional decals. And whilst no, it doesn't fire, I'm sorry to say, it does still have some functional components like the spring-loaded trigger and magazine release, and a cartridge release mechanism where you can load rounds into the chamber too. For me, the initial printing stage required several full build plates, and thanks to the easy use of the bamboo slicer, it was just a case of drop the files into the bed and paint the supports on in areas where overhangs were parallel to the build plate. That's it. Click slice and print, and then come back when each print is done. And thanks to the X1's features, I even have a sexy time lapse for every stage of printing. So, knowing how easily distracted we can get, I knew going into this project I wanted to save myself as much time as possible in the post-processing stage. And as you probably know, FDM printing, unlike resin printing, has a significant detail difference. No matter how low an FDM printer layer lines are, you're still going to see them. But really, it's a bit of a balancing act. The first few parts I printed were at 0.08mm layer height, and that was using the default 0.4mm nozzle that this printer comes equipped with. And this was to make the layers as thin as possible. But each of those first couple of prints took a day or two each. It would have taken the best part of a fortnight of constant printing to get all of the components. And I knew I'd get distracted long before that time was up. So, on the advice of the actual creator of these files, I had a go at a 0.2mm layer height, and yeah, there is a quality difference here, but it's not huge. More importantly though, I got all the prints printed in just 3 days. Looking back though, I probably would have gone down to 0.12mm layers and completely avoided sanding altogether. Because, as I said, I have a somewhat fresh idea to deal with layer lines, and I'll get to that later. I think you'll like it. It's not a huge deal, but, well, as you can see from the finished model, it worked. And it's also worth noting that I used Elegoo filament for this project, and you might be asking why. And the real reason is because it was on offer. I got 10 1kg reels for £90. Yeah, it's boring and black, but I'm painting over this anyway, and it may not be the best filament around either, but I'm sure you'll agree from how well this came out, it's more than good enough. And the best thing is, it all worked fine using the default PLA settings on the bamboo slicer. Anyway, once you get everything printed, it then comes to assembly, and what's really good is this model comes with a handy assembly guide, and it makes it as simple as an IKEA flat pack. It uses a combination of glue along with some specifically sized nuts, bolts, springs and magnets, and that's to get some of the mechanics working, but there's also a decent aesthetic choice to them too. And I'm sure, like me, you'll agree, it's often a weird thing when you see Warhammer stuff scaled up in real life. Even when it comes to many of Games Workshop's licensed partners, most companies always add some weird embellishments to things that just do not go with how my brain perceives the grimdark future to actually be. And yeah, the big GW kinda also has their own artwork style, which differs somewhat to their models. But you know what we all spend the most time looking at? The miniatures. And it's rare that anything from video games to statues looks like what we see on the tabletop. Just look at the action figures from McFarlane Toys. Why have they changed the shape of the Aquila on the chest? Why is it different to what we all know and love on the models? It makes me think back to the video by Midwinter Minis where he picked up a Bloodraven statue of a Space Marine. Yeah, it looks awesome, I'd love to have one, you'd love one. But whilst it has the general shape right, the proportions are completely off. Small head, small backpack, and who in their right mind approved the shape of those knee pads? Like most real-life Warhammer adaptations, this is heading more towards the uncanny valley. In fact, the only people I've seen get it right so far are Joy Toy with their action figures. Like, these things are so good, they make McFarlane of all people, look like an embarrassment. Though to be fair, the statues that GW are now using at events are far better than they were previously. The Terminator that seems to be at every convention they've had in the last year is just incredible to look at. It's amazing. Yeah, I'm not going to print one of them. Now, whilst I say all that, and I do have that appreciation, this bolt rifle isn't a one-to-one recreation of a bolt rifle. I mean, it can't be. It needs to be inspired by, otherwise it's, you know, there's got to be some copyright law there that I don't understand. But this model that's inspired by a bolt rifle has some incredible enhancements, and the enhancements that Tame Grips has made, well, they work, and they work really well. I mean, I added the winged skull on the front for more of a Warhammer style weapon, but take that away and the layman could easily think this is just any old other modern weapon rather than something from a sci-fi universe. You know, if it wasn't bright red. And I had a chat with Tame Grips about his experience in realistic weaponry, and as he explains it, he actually grew up around veterans and took an interest in weaponry from a young age. And he enjoys the challenges of these designs. He uses the miniatures as an initial point of reference, and he imagines what type of weaponry inspired the original creators. Using that, he then goes on to create something a bit more true to life. And the way everything looks when it goes together is a fantastic balance of the 40k weapon that inspired this fan art, and it blends incredibly well with contemporary realistic weapons. Even things like the bolts and screws that hold this together aren't just functional, each one is a fitting and stylistic choice too. And whilst there is some function on the weapon, this is a choice of the designer as well. If too many mechanical elements are added, it could put people off trying to create it. At the end of the day, this thing's just made to be shown off in person for its looks or mounted on your wall. So while, yeah, I've always been a stickler for more direct recreations of source material from the miniatures themselves, independent creators can't actually do that without the risk of getting into trouble. And I hope you'll agree that where this succeeds and others fail is simply because, well, this one looks good. Now, when you go into this project, assembly can take a bit of time, and I recommend you dry fit all the parts first as best you can, just to get an idea of what components should be which colour. And this is hard to do when you're just surrounded by nothing more than different shaped lumps of plastic. And once it's partially built, you can glue on some of the parts in place. I recommend super glue or a 2-part epoxy. Both are strong, but the epoxy has a little bit more flex to it. Now, I talked earlier about sanding, and when it comes to the upper housing, this is where I tried getting it to look as smooth as possible. So I tried my hand at resin smoothing for PLA. I used some of my own WARHAMMER resin and brushed this on with sponge brushes. Now, if you're going to do this, make sure you use eye protection to cure this with a large UV lamp or a UV torch. Once the whole thing is done, swab it down with some isopropanol and sand it smooth. Honestly though, this was more effort than I was willing to put in for the rest of the weapon. I wanted to give it a go, and this is what I'd do if I wanted everything ultimately smooth. As for the rest of the parts, well, here's my secret solution as to how I smoothed those out. And yeah, you're going to hate me for dragging out the reveal, so feel free to flame me in the comments, but hey, it works. Now, as noted earlier, people smooth their PLA parts in various ways, but what do those of us who are super lazy do? Well, we just spray paint them. Yeah, that's it. Spray paint them. Excessively. Hang on, let me show you. So every single part of this model had 3 thick coats of cheap grey filler primer added to them. All the silver and black parts had black primer added, again in thick coats. Basically, I went as thick as I could go without causing it to run, and whilst I wanted to use Chaos Black spray to do this properly, I opted for TT Combat Black because it dried a little bit glossier, which should also help add a little bit more shine to the silver. And speaking of, these silver parts were printed with a cheap gunmetal spray that I found on Amazon, though arguably this is far too bright for a gunmetal. But it's on now, so it'll have to do. Once again though, do this in multiple, really thick coats of paint. Now the chassis at least, that was appropriately painted with Mephiston Red, because, well, it just seems wrong not to paint some of it with the official colours. I'd have actually done the silver in Lead Belcher, but my local store was out of stock. And again, as I said, any risk of delaying this project would lead to it not being completed. I did, however, leave the handle in its original matte black plastic. I think both the material and the texture actually suited the style of the overall piece. It just stands out a bit differently to the foregrip, and I think that gives it a little bit more of an element of realism. So yeah, after a couple or 3 days letting these parts dry, it was back to the final assembly. So to make this a proper bolter, there was one thing missing, and that was a winged skull insignia for the side. But to ensure this was detailed as possible, I actually printed this in resin on my Saturn III Ultra and painted it with, that's right, Retributor armor. Had to be done, right? Now, I've been told that to make any good YouTube video successful, you really need to tell a compelling story throughout the video. Midwinter Minis did it when his Titan was a celebration for his patrons, Squidmar did it with the Manta because he got 20,000 likes on another video. And I'd like to say the story of this video is about how I was able to finish a project overcoming my challenges with ADHD. But it's not. I did it by cutting as many corners as I possibly could, and I printed this for no other reason than it looks cool. Hashtag story. But I tell you what, if this video gets 20,000 likes, I'll print a 2-meter tall Emperor Titan. Honestly though, this project really makes me appreciate the effort that cosplayers put into what they do. I simply don't have the skill to design any of this stuff, never mind the knowledge of how to actually make it functional or put most of it together. All I did here was print and paint a thing, yet this still took the best part of a week. Although to be fair, one evening of that was me wasting time sanding the chassis. With modern printers and enough paint, you can get this looking more than good enough without any of that lark. If you want more proof, check out the design on this one, printed by Big Bear 3D and painted by Jacob from Hobby Goblin Studio. These weren't sanded at all. It's super cool, right? Like, tell me you've seen a more interesting paint job on a prop inspired by Warhammer. And it goes to show that whilst the bolter has inspired this, without adding the skull emblem, this could really be anything you imagine. I'm genuinely consider paying these guys for some kind of faux hammer branded one. Maybe it'll happen one day, and you can see more from these guys by following the links in the description. For me though, it was just a super fun project, and it hasn't put me off future endeavours. In fact, I'm already halfway through a similar project I'll never finish that's a tad more heretical. Though, if somebody out there has the skill, I'd really appreciate it if you could sculpt a printable weapon rack so I could wall mount this mighty armament. And dearest Games Workshop, if you're watching, know that I love you, but please do whatever you need to do in order to partner up with Hasbro and get us some Nerf blasters in the shape of a bolt gun. What do you guys think of this? Is it a project you'd want to take on? Is there a way you'd want to see it improved? Let me know down in the comments. I'm sure Tame Groups will welcome your feedback too, because he'll be reading it as well. I want to say thanks for watching, and if you need any tips on 3D printing or which printers you should get, check out my other videos. Don't forget to like this one, comment for the algorithm, and subscribe. Thanks to our channel members for helping us keep this channel alive, and they get lots of benefits you can see by clicking the button below this video. Until next time, don't worry, be happy. WARHAMMER out.